I think there's three ways that you can grow in a podcast. The first is by starting a podcast. Now, I think that is probably the slowest way because just because you launch a podcast, that doesn't mean you're going to have all these listeners. The thing that's worked out best is just getting your guests to promote the show. And there's a little hack that I learned recently that's helped a lot is the day after the recording, send the guests a calendar placeholder on the day the show's going to go live. And so it's like a little reminder for them. And when they see it, it has a little message like, this is the day that our show is going to go live. Feel free to work with your content team so you can make plans to help promote it. The podcast is going to have maybe one ad or maybe two at the most. And because the host usually reads the ad, the listeners are tuned in. They trust the podcast host. That's why they keep turning in on a consistent basis. And so if they're recommending a product, then more than likely they're going to have the ears perked up and think, okay, let me hear more about this. I didn't know about this. That sounds pretty interesting. I think I may need that for my business. Yeah, sure. I'll check that out.
Welcome back to the SDR Hire podcast. This week, we have a little bit of a different concept. So I'm interviewing a friend of mine who's a business owner and has a podcasting business. Now, this interview is a part of a series of interviews that I did for another podcast that I had an idea for called The Dropped Playbook. Now, I gave up on that podcast concept for the time being, but I didn't want to let those interviews go to waste. So I hope you enjoy listening to Eric, how he's growing his podcasting business using different growth channels. And obviously, I hope you enjoy this and subscribe. Let's go. Eric, welcome to the Drop Playbook.
Hey, Stefan, happy to be here.
Amazing, man. I'm so happy to have you on. It's been a while since we chatted with each other. And so this is, I think, a great opportunity for both of us. I want to show the audience what interesting things you're doing and how you're doing them. And so it's been a while since we actually met, but I realized I don't know too much about your background. So who is Eric Melchor?
I'm from Houston. My background's digital marketing. When I was younger, my dream job was to be in marketing and have like a marketing director type role where I was managing large budgets, large teams. And I was able to achieve that through my career. And then once I got to that position, though, I felt like even though it was the job I always wanted, it wasn't really giving me a lot of fulfillment. And so I started doing other activities on the side. I launched a nonprofit. I taught as an adjunct professor. And then when COVID happened, my wife and I made the decision to move to Bucharest. She's Romanian. And we made that decision because her parents could help out with the kids. And it was a really good decision. The transition has been really good. But when I moved here, completely changed industries. I started working for myself as a contractor, and I got up into the SaaS industry and startup world. And that was almost about 4 years ago. And since then, there's been a number of things. There's been a lot of ups and downs. But now there's a new venture I'm working on that I'm pretty excited about that I'm sure that we'll get into.
100%. Exactly. So you and I met while you were working with Optimonk. And if I recall correctly, you were hunting for partnership opportunities and you were, I think, evangelizing the product through like multiple podcasts that you were on. And I'm not sure if you were hosting a podcast yourself for Optimonk or not.
Yeah. So actually to go before Optimonk, I started Innovators Can Laugh. It was my own podcast. I was interviewing European startup founders. I started by interviewing just Romanian founders, and then I was going country by country for each season. So the first season, like 20 Romanian entrepreneurs. The next season, it would be another country like Lithuania, then Bulgaria, then Hungary. And one of the guests I had on the show was Csaba Zsadó. He's the founder of Optimonk. He's a Hungarian startup founder. And that's how I got to know him. He started learning more about me because that was my side gig. My full-time gig, I was the partnership manager for a startup called Bonjoro. And they were based out of Australia. And I was the partnership manager. And I was doing things like hosting co-webinars. I was doing a lot of social selling. And I was also in charge of like the integrations with the other partnerships that we had. And he started seeing some of the work that I was expressing on LinkedIn. And he sort of poached me. He's like, hey, come over here to Optimonk. Can you do that for us? And so I went to Optimonk as an ambassador type role. But that was the first real position I ever got without having to submit a resume or even do an interview. So I do want to just say that it's great if you start getting your name out there, either it's through a newsletter, maybe it's just through LinkedIn or a podcast. But I'm a big believer now in sharing your work in public.
Real quick, if you're a sales leader or you know someone who's looking for support when it comes to cold outreach, cold calling, cold email, LinkedIn outreach. We build SDR and BDR teams for companies or complement their existing teams with top talent, remote SDRs and BDRs that are exceptional in outreach skills. So if you'd like to get in touch, just visit sdrhire.com and book a call with our team. All right, back to the show. I do have one question for you, and I think a lot of founders and like people who want to get themselves out there ask themselves, is it worth it? Creating a podcast, doing all of those things that you don't really know if they're going to bring you something or not, and like how big of a hassle is it actually to run a podcast without making money off of it, at least in the beginning?
Okay. I think there's 3 ways that you can grow in a podcast. The first is by starting a podcast. Now, I think that is probably the slowest way, because just because you launch a podcast, that doesn't mean you're going to have all these listeners, right? And you may have different types of ICPs or different people, and that podcast is not going to appeal to everybody. That's why there's SaaS companies out there like Drift. They have 7 different podcasts in their network. Even Charles Schwab, I think they have 3. IBM has 15 different podcasts in their network because they're appealing to different segments of their target market. So even if you launch a podcast, you really have to be smart and think, what specific segment of my customers do I want to go after? And it's a lot of work, because easily you ask anybody, it's an automatic 10 to 15 hours every week just to produce and distribute one podcast, right? So that's the first way. The second way is through guest podcasting. This is where I bring out the $300,000. When I was at Bonjoro prior to OptiMonk, me, Casey, and Ollie, there was three of us that were going on podcasts talking about Bonjoro, talking about the benefits, how customers use our product. And over time, we were asking new signups, where did you hear about us? And more started to indicate podcasts. And so after about 18 months, we went back and looked at the data, and we figured out that podcasting generated a lift of about $300 in annual revenue for us. And so that was a very good way to try and grow the business using guest podcasting as a growth channel. Here's the caveat, right? Is that you got to take the time, go pitch the podcast, take the time to go do the interview, and you got to do at least 30 or 40 before you start to see that uptick. You're not going to just do one and all of a sudden you're going to get all this new revenue. It doesn't work that way. You got to go, and we saw around the 30 mark is when we started seeing there's a lift in traffic and a lift in signups, right? So that's the second way. And then the third way is through sponsorships. And so that's what I focus on right now with my B2B podcast network, is where you're working with industry professionals. You have your brand featured alongside them, where they're actually humanizing your brand, talking about your brand in a very authentic manner to their audience that probably is very likely your audience, right? If it's the same kind of audience and same kind of listeners. And the reason why podcasting works is that unlike other channels where they're very saturated by a lot of ads, generally a podcast is going to have maybe 1 ad or maybe 2 at the most. And so because the host usually reads the ad, the listeners are tuned in. They trust the podcast host. That's why they keep turning in on a consistent basis. And so if they're recommending a product, then more than likely they're going to have the ears perked up and think, okay, let me hear more about this. I didn't know about this. That sounds pretty interesting. I think I may need that for my business. Yeah, sure. I'll check that out. So those are the 3 different ways. And absolutely, depending on which way you pick, there is opportunities to grow through podcasting. And again, just to reiterate those, is starting your own, going through as a guest, or 3 through sponsorships.
It's amazing to actually be on a podcast with another podcast host, because the way that you speak is very structured, and I can just hear that you are very used to this way of speaking. So I actually really appreciate that. It's refreshing, I would say. So that was a good segue into what you're doing right now. But tell me, what OptiMonk, and the moment that you launched your podcast network, did you launch it during your partnership time with OptiMonk or after? And what was the igniting spark that made it all happen?
Yeah, good question. I was actually frustrated because I was having a hard time finding a sponsor. So here's the thing. If you want to try to get paid for being a podcaster, generally you can go to the different ad networks out there. Spotify has one, Podbean or whatever. You go sign up, you say I'm a podcaster, then they ask you to upload your download numbers. And B2B podcasts, it's no secret. We're not like true crime podcasts out there that have thousands and thousands of monthly downloads, right? No, we only have maybe in the hundreds. And because we don't have those high monthly downloads, those networks don't really want us. And so we're not going to get any business from them. And the business model doesn't work for B2B podcasters because those models only work on a CPM basis, which is like a cost per thousand downloads. And if your podcast is not even getting 1,000, then you're not going to make any money working with those networks. So you're never going to see any sort of sponsorship deals. So the other way to try to go about it is to try to do outbound or code email efforts and try to pitch your podcast. But then again, the potential sponsor says, okay, what are your download numbers? And then you got to only get like 300 a month. And that just doesn't sound that appealing, right? It's a very hard sell. And so I had this idea and I thought, I know there's a lot of other B2B podcasters that are in my same boat. We've got monthly expenses just to operate our show anywhere from $300 to $500. We've been doing this a couple of years.
Exactly.
And we would love to just make a little bit of money to just pay for the cost of the show and maybe a little bit of extra because we do have audiences that are very valuable, right? Our audience consists of decision makers, people that want to learn about new tools, right? Our audience are B2B marketers, they're founders, they're people in the tech space. And so they are making decisions on different tools that can cost anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 a year. And so our audience is valuable. And so I started approaching some podcasters that I knew over the past 2 or 3 years through LinkedIn and just pitching the idea like, hey, what if we presented ourselves as like a group sponsorship? Let's aggregate all of our supply. And you've got 200 downloads. He's got 500. I got 400. They have 600. Together, we have 10,000 monthly downloads. Why don't we pitch that to a sponsor and say, you're not just sponsoring my podcast, but you're going to sponsor 10 podcasts over the span of whatever number of weeks. And so you're doing this one deal. I'm going to be a broker and you don't have to work with all those other podcasters. I'm going to coordinate everything. I'll do all the operations and administration. It basically saves you time and all that headache of trying to reach out to every of these podcasters and negotiate a separate deal. I'll take care of all of that. And so that's how the idea formed. It formed back in September of last year. And I think now we're up to over 20 different podcasters on board that are specifically in the B2B space. Minimum criteria is that they've had to at least publish 30 episodes, very consistent, at least one episode every other week, and ideally be rated a top 10% or higher global podcast rating. So I just thought of this really like less than 5 months ago, Stefan.
Yeah, I remember. I think it's a genius idea. Honestly, I think this business is going to blow up as soon as it picks up a little bit. I think it's going to blow up because it's just a huge no-brainer, especially because obviously, if you're doing a podcast, you have some kind of audience somewhere else that you're funneling towards a podcast. So you either have a LinkedIn or maybe you have a newsletter, maybe you have an Instagram profile. And you can then additionally leverage those other channels into your pitch. And then you can say, instead of, hey, we have 5 podcasts and 2,000 subscribers, you can say, yeah, it's 5 podcasters with, combined audience of 20, 30,000. Now that seems impressive.
Yeah.
And then I guess you can probably like have different tiers. So if you want to like distribute your ads towards the podcast as well as the newsletter, then it's a higher price, whatever. So I really think that's a genius idea. Now, what makes me really curious is, how are companies, how are brands reacting to because I can imagine that it's not that easy finding somebody who's gonna see that value, because they would rather have things very safe, especially if they gotta put out like 5 or 10 grand for an ad.
Yeah, I'll just tell you about our first client, right?
Yeah.
They found us back in, I think it was late October last year, through a LinkedIn post. I was talking about the network. They got curious, and I had just a simple sort of one-page website. It was really my podcast website, but I had created another page, and it was like an MVP. And I talked about the network, and they checked it out. They were curious. They pinged me on DM, through a DM on LinkedIn. And they were like, hey, Eric, I was checking this out, curious, want to hop on a call, and I'd love to learn more about it. And I asked him some of the questions of, why are you interested in this in the first place? And he said, some of our traditional channels like blogs and some white papers, they're just not generating the kind of traffic that we really anticipated. And so I'm looking for new channels to explore and experiment with. And so he was interested in doing a test campaign. And we did one for, I think it was only 3 weeks across 7 podcasts. And I kid you not, in the second week, he started asking questions like, okay, if we were to extend this for an entire quarter and add a few other podcasts, what would that look like? And the reason why he wanted to extend it is because he had this tool that allowed him to see what companies were coming to his website from our podcast. And so he had provided UTM links for each podcaster to use in the show description. People were listening to the show, they were clicking on that link. And so he was able to track and look at the ROI from the podcast experiment. And he really determined like, oh yeah, we've got some high quality leads here. Let's go ahead and extend this for an entire quarter. And again, one of the big misconceptions is that you really can't track podcasting efforts.
Right.
That's a lie. No, you can. Like we did it at Bonjoro, very simple. We asked an additional question, where did you hear about us? That's a simple thing that anybody can do. But if you want to get a little bit more sophisticated, give each podcaster their own UTM tracking link, get a technology platform like Leadfeeder, right? And if anybody who clicks on that link, you can see what companies are coming to your website from that podcast. And what they're doing is pretty sophisticated, because if it's a high quality lead and they can see what pages they clicked on, then they can actually do some retargeting or actually get a sales rep to do some outbound marketing, try to re-engage that person. And so now we're doing a campaign with them where for its entire quarter, we've got 10 different podcasts that they're experimenting with. And that was our first client. Again, it was through a LinkedIn post. They found us, they reached out because he was frustrated. The O channels just weren't working that well.
And were you able to get more companies like them to join the network, or rather to start purchasing ad placements in your network?
Okay, so far we've had, I would say, 5 different inquiries. Now, one, they were really interested in e-commerce podcasts. I only focus on SaaS and B2B. The other one wanted logistics. They were trying to reach out to logistic and supply management people. And I'm like, we're really just more of like tech and SaaS. And then the other 2, I think we sent out proposals and they're trying to get the budget to do these campaigns. They're very interested, very excited about this. Now, so that's the first customer. The MVP worked. I proved the MVP worked. Now, the next step is a legit website, an official website, have some social proof on there, kind of show how it works, talk about the pricing a little bit, and then why you wouldn't want to work with us. And I think that's a very interesting page. Okay, let me see why I wouldn't want to work with them. And so that website actually goes live this weekend. And I'm pretty excited about that, because once that goes live, then I'll start experimenting with some Google paid search ads, which I plan to launch very soon. I've got some email automation set up. I'm going to have a lead magnet. And then also for anybody who submits an inquiry, and if they don't sign up automatically to do a campaign, then I'll have some emails that will go out periodically, educating them more about our services and about the experience of other clients.
Are you looking to acquire new or improve your existing cold outreach skills? Whether you're trying to break into cold outreach or you're already doing some outbound sales, we have a home for you. Join our community for cold outreach and attend exclusive cold outreach workshops, masterclasses with big cold outreach and cold outbound sales names, or choose to take one of our courses and complete them at your own pace. The link to join is in the description below. All right, back to the show.
I know you're a big fan of Alex Hormozi. I want to jump into there about what impact his book had on me. But before we jump into there, any other questions about how we got started?
Yeah, so there is a couple that I wanted to quickly go over, which is, are you currently working alone, or do you have some kind of support, maybe a partner, a co-founder, somebody? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'm self-employed and I launched a business. I'm not a business owner yet. I'm self-employed. When I mapped it out, I think there's at least 5 different roles that I'm working. One of them is like operations. One of them is marketing. When you're a business owner, you're doing all the different jobs and you've got these different titles, right? And so now I'm managing everything. One thing that really helped is that I offloaded a lot of my podcast production and distribution, and even my newsletter, to a virtual assistant who's basically handling like 90% of that, because that was taking up probably 6 to 8 hours a week of my time. And so now just handing that off to her is going to free up a lot of my time so I can focus on this. The goal is now I've got checklists and playbooks so far for 3 different, what I call departments, or the people who are going to be leading that specific job function. And hopefully this year I get at least 1 or 2 of those people to get hired on board. But of course, that it's all dependent on how
Revenue.
much business I generate.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of which, I honestly, this is just a comment, but I really see this becoming, I'm just looking in the future. Just like IBM has 15 different podcasts for 15 different, let's say, audiences or ICP, whatever you want to call them, so can this be like, all right, we've got a pod for SaaS, right? We've got a pod for e-commerce, pod for 1, 2, 3. And each of those, like, you could literally come up with a completely new metrics system for evaluating how much, what's it called? Like media.
They call it ROAS, return on ad spend.
You could probably like create a completely new metric system for like how do you value the media spend and what's the ROAS on podcasts that are specific to those niches. So I really love that. But yes, let's jump into, I'm a huge fan of Alex Hormozi. Obviously, he got famous initially after selling his company Gym Launch and a couple of other, and then launching his book, $100 million Offers. He recently launched $100 million Leads. I know that you became a fan. Recently, you read his $100 million Offers. I don't know, maybe you can tell me, like, what's the takeaway? What's the highlight of getting exposed to a guy like him, and what did you learn?
There's a before and after. He's one of those guys, Tony Robbins. If you really let the materials sink in, and if you call it drinking the Kool-Aid, whatever, there's a lot of value from people who've been there and done it. The guy's been there and done it. And so there's a before and after, where before I would send out a proposal, and it just basically was like, hey, you can do 21 episode sponsorship, and this is the cost, pretty much, right? After reading that book, now I have different names for the different options. So like one option is like the Audience Awareness Accelerator. And not only are you going to get like the podcast, the host rate ed on the sponsors, you're going to get like a one-on-one podcast advertising orientation with me, where I explain everything about podcast sponsorships and what it's going to be like working with us. There's also going to be like a custom and genuine host rate ad with a call to action that I'm going to create for you. There's going to be done for you UTM tracking codes that we're going to apply to every podcaster, so you can measure this on the background. There's going to be like a check-in email once a week from me, where you're going to have access to a Google Sheet, and you can see all the links and timestamps where your podcast ads are running. But that's just the podcast. And like where you were going with this earlier is that a lot of podcasters also have a newsletter, or they have a YouTube channel, right? Or they're really prominent on LinkedIn. And so it's like some other options, like another option is called LinkedIn Liftoff, where you could sponsor live LinkedIn events. And during those LinkedIn events, the host is going to talk about you and include your details in the sponsorship description. And they're going to tag you, and they're going to do short clips of the podcast and promote those on LinkedIn. And then there's also what I call B2B Video Explosion. And this is where you can do like a brand, a YouTube channel of some of our B2B content creators. You could do like a sponsor video highlight, like a 15 seconds, and we'll include that in the interview. And then we can even do a 5 or 10 minute product demo video that's created by one of our people in our network that specializes in that. So there's all these different options, and that's like the after picture. I don't know if it's overwhelming or not, but I want to show people that we're not just a podcast network. We're really a growth partner. That's how I'm trying to position ourselves, is that we're a strategic partner here. There's other things that our podcasters can do if you would like. But our core is podcasting, but there's other things that we can do.
I love that. And just to showcase what it actually meant before and after reading the $100 million offers. And so the main premise is that basically you create an offer that is so good, people feel stupid saying no to. And I think what you did is basically you took literally everything that you would do anyway to make sure that things are running smoothly, that your clients are getting the right, let's say, the right experience. And you just named it, you just packaged it in a way that shows value, right? Yeah. And it gives a perception of, don't get me wrong, but it sounds and feels better than when you just say, hey, we're a B2B podcast network and you get X amount of views and maybe somebody purchases. It doesn't really, this sounds so much better. Is that kind of what happened?
Absolutely. And when you have these like packages available and you're showcasing like all the value that you provide, then you can charge more. It's just before I read the book, I had an idea of, okay, this is how much I'm going to charge in terms of for a campaign deal. After reading the book and after putting this down on paper and presenting these offers, It's no, I'm going to charge more than double that because actually there's a lot of value there. It's worth it. It's worth it. And so completely game changer for me. And I think that anybody who is a small business owner, especially in services, they would find that book very valuable.
I agree. And also what I just realized is because basically the way he often talks about positioning, he just wants to create an environment where your clients can't really compare you to anything else. And I think that you're really getting there. I'm just thinking, is there anything similar to that? And not really. And so when there's nothing you can compare to, when you don't have anything specific to compare yourself, or rather your clients can compare you, then you can literally raise prices. What are they going to say? Oh, it's too much. How do you know it's too much? So I really love what you've done there.
Yeah, I would say that now I think this works in the first, when you're first starting off, right? Because you really got to go the extra mile and provide all that value. The problem is with this business here, the problem is that a lot of these packages are custom. So if I'm looking to sell this later on, and I'm talking like 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I can't sell it when every package out there, every proposal is a custom proposal. But that's a problem that I think I'll worry about later on down the road.
Exactly.
Right now, it's obviously just to get some traction, just start getting some clients, and then I'll start creating like standard packages.
Yeah.
And so that way it's okay. We have package A, B, and C. These are the people who can fulfill it. And it won't really be so custom. But right now it's very custom. That's a problem for later on. And the good thing is that I realize that. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. And who cares? Is it making money? Yes. Amazing. At least the way I'm thinking about it, keep doing custom until you have enough money, bandwidth, and practice that it can become less custom and more standardized. And until then, who cares, right? It doesn't matter. But speaking of money and standardizing things, where do you see the network in, let's say, revenue? What are your goals by the end of 2024? I'm assuming you're moving towards a certain goal, what you want to achieve.
My goal this year is to pay out $70,000 in, call it commission or revenue, to podcasters, right? Pay out $70,000 for the business. I want to do minimum $100,000 in billings for the business this year. So that's the goal. It's really a good feeling when you are paying people who join your community. And so it's also a podcast for B2B podcasters community. We support each other. We learn from each other. We have these monthly meetups. We have this private Slack community. And I'm trying to make you money. And so it's this really cool job that I've created for myself where I get to network. I get to build relationships. I get to help brands become a strategic partner. And then I also get to help other podcasters, most of them who've never had any sort of income from their podcast, actually make a little money. So it's a really cool, I would say, little job that I've created by myself. But make no mistake, 2024 may be 100,000 in annual revenue, but I think in 3 years, I want to be pulling closer to 500,000. And then in 10 years, ultimately, this be running close to $3 million business.
I would say you're selling yourself short. I'm not sure how big the market is, but I really feel like this can potentially be like a huge 8 to 9 figure business simply because there is more and more podcasts actually in the B2B space, even more so, at least that I'm seeing, that are starting. And there is also, at least this is the way how I'm thinking, at some point you could probably start, hey, let me help you start a podcast. And when they do, oh, by the way, here's a network where you can tap into. And so, yeah, I really think it can grow a lot bigger than what you're expecting.
No, I think it could. I didn't really think about that in terms of like maybe courses or showing people how to start one. I was thinking more along the lines of, let me nail this space down first, and then I can go and do an e-commerce podcast network, and then maybe a supply and logistic podcast network, or even med tech. I had guys reaching out to me, hey, I've got this medical podcast. I saw your network. Do you have any sponsors that look for medical tech? And I'm like, sorry, man, at this time I don't. But there's all those different categories out there that I think I could try to, after I get the B2B SaaS space, maybe focus on one of those. But first, I really got to get this right first. And I think it's going to take 2 to 3 years to get this down.
Sure. Fair enough. Maybe a bit of a challenging question. What would need to happen for you to, for example, hit those $100,000 in the next 3 months?
Yeah, it's funny. The first thing is that my kids don't get sick and I have time to focus and work. And I say that because this week, my son has COVID. He was out 2 days. On Wednesday, the kids had no school, so they were home on Wednesday. The 2 weeks prior to that, my little daughter, she had a minor surgery, so she was home for 2 weeks. And my kids are young. They're 4 and 6. You can't just tell them,
Yeah.
leave me alone. So ultimately my main goal in life right now is to be a good dad. That to me, being a good dad, I may suck at a lot of other things, but I feel like I'm a good student when it comes to being a good dad. I'm present with them. I work with them all the time, and I really enjoy and love that. And because of that, I tend to, when they are home, I tend to put work away, or I wake up really early, like at 4 a.m. and try to get as much done before they wake up. And so what would need to happen, honestly, is I've got a lot of clarity and focus on what I need to get done. What's really helped me, Stefan, is just basically listing all the things that I want to do in a quarter and just asking myself, okay, what would Alex Hormozi do? And I know I'm kissing this guy's ass, at least that's what it sounds like. But the thing is that the guy is very focused, and I feel like he's one of those people that moves very fast. And I'm somebody that, okay, I just created a website, honestly, I used a system called system.io, and it's a drag and drop interface, very easy system to use. And when I was thinking about the layout and the content, I thought, you know what, I could probably get this done in a couple of weeks, right? That's the old Eric, right? And when I thought, what would Alex Hormozi do? I thought he'd knock this shit out in 2 days, and I kid you not, I basically got it up and running in 2 days. Now I still need to do the automations and make sure that all the triggers are working correctly. But I was so proud of myself in being able to knock something out in that short time span. I did that on Monday and Tuesday when the kids were at school. Now, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they're at home. I didn't really get a lot done, but I feel like when they're at school, I can really get a lot done. And so if to do that in 3 months, the first thing is I just need time. I can't do this if I only have 3 hours a day, right? I need that
Fair.
good 10 hours a day, man. And if they're at school and they're consistent, they're not sick, and they're not home for the holidays, I really can get a lot knocked out.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Although I don't have kids yet, it's very understandable. And it's really precious to hear you being so focused on them and like prioritizing them in front of the business. And I agree with you. I think that the business it doesn't really matter that much. And like the memories that you might lose out with your kids are more important than potentially like expediting the growth of your business. But it's so cool to hear you say those things. And obviously I'm relating here because just recently I've been thinking like, or rather, I realized that if I give myself, for example, 3 hours to finish something, it will take me 3.5 hours to finish it.
Yeah.
If I give myself an hour,
Yeah.
I will finish it in an hour, maybe hour and a half.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's the difference? And so it's just the focus and the expectation that you put in front of yourself. And I really think that there is somebody who I should probably quote here who actually said something like this, that is, if you give yourself the limit, you will hit that limit, whatever that limit is, whether it's 100 hours or an hour, something like that.
Yeah, another little trick I do, I'll just set a timer on my phone. So I'll work like in 45 minutes. I've got different increments, 20 minutes, 30,
Right.
45. And okay, this project, I'm going to knock it out in 45 minutes, give it myself. And I'll actually close a lot of my tabs, especially LinkedIn. So I don't want to hear notifications or anything like that, and just really focus on whatever task it is.
Yeah, that's also another great hack. And before I forget, let me segue into this with another question. So going back to Alex Hormozi, he is all about focusing on high leverage activities and then basically excluding low leverage activities. And so you said something interesting before we started recording, which is that you realized that there were some activities that were low leverage and how you fixed them. So I'm just curious for you to share that.
Yeah, my weekly newsletter. This is my personal weekly newsletter. It's people who subscribe to the podcast or have gone to my cocktail parties over the years. And every week I talk about my latest episode. And I usually share like something that I learned or just like a helpful tip. Maybe it's about partnership marketing. Maybe it's how to be a good guest on a podcast, whatever. It's usually around podcasts. And then I share like this funny New York Times cartoon, like a new one. And then I have at the end what I was working on at the end of the week. That alone, easily 2 to 3 hours every week. And then there's the podcasting distribution, writing the show notes, right? Doing the Canva graphic for the podcast art cover, making sure it gets distributed like on YouTube and Buzzsprout and all those other things, right? So there's that part. And I realized that I've been doing this. This takes me easily 7-8 hours a week on average. And this is not going to help the business grow. Now, I don't want to lose it, But so I needed to figure out what can I do here? And so you can't really automate that stuff. And trust me, I've got a lot of processes in place, but you still need somebody to do a lot of the manual work. And so I found somebody who's really good, and I started working with her, and she's going to take care of pretty much 95% of it. So I'm excited about that because that gives me a few hours back during my week. And in terms of this new business, there are different playbooks for different parts of what I see the business. So for example, onboarding a new podcaster. There's a lot of different things that go into. I got to have the welcome call. Maybe I don't need that later on down the road, but right now we're still fairly new and I want to know who I'm bringing into the community. They have a lot of questions that they want to get answered, like how do they get paid? Can they turn down a sponsor? Just all those different things and letting them know about our Slack group. And anyway, I've got like a playbook, like a checklist for that. And I figure one of the first people that I bring on board, like part-time, will be somebody who can onboard the new podcasters and include all of their information, like in this Notion template that I have that has information about their show. It also has information about where do we send the payment to. They send them the agreement that we have in place. So there's like all those little things that they're not really helping the business grow. It's a low leverage activity. And that's something that in the near future, I'm going to have to give that responsibility to somebody else. And so that's what I'm trying to identify right now. What are the low leverage activities in the business that I'm going to hire first for?
Makes so much sense. I struggle with the same thing. I think I spend even more time on those activities than you. I actually have this podcast. I have the SDR Hire podcast to help SDR Hire grow my other company. And basically, it's so much work. And yeah, I agree with you. Like I have a guy helping me out with like short form content and creating some kind of things. But again, it's a lot of work. I'm a bit of a micromanager. I really want things to be perfect, what I put out there. So do you face those things? And like, how much are you actually like, how much it costs you? Where did you find this person to help you? Obviously, I can imagine that you're like a very scrapey when it comes to money, especially in these early stages. How can you afford actually somebody to help you?
So I have one that's been helping me for the past couple of years. I found her, I think, through Fiverr, and she's based out of the Philippines. And I really wrote out step by step in a Google Doc what she needs to do. And that was specifically for the podcast distribution part. Mm-hmm. But now that I need more help with the newsletter aspect, this other person actually found me. She reached out to me through LinkedIn. She's a podcaster herself. She's based out of India. And I know she helps out with podcast post-production and distribution. And over the past few months, I've gotten to know her. I saw her content. She actually sent me this growth playbook for podcasts that I flipped through it. And there was actually some really cool stuff in there. And I'm like, oh, this girl knows her stuff. And so we just exchanging and kept in contact. And finally, I said, hey, I think we can work together. And when we got together, I pitched her the idea of managing my podcast production and newsletter. I need to be scrappy with money. And I think I could probably reduce that expense if I have her do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, finding great folks that don't make you break the bank, it's challenging. It is for me as well. But yeah, okay, cool. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm just curious, what are some of the specific channels that you're currently leveraging to grow either the podcast network side of things, as well as going after getting new sponsors?
Yeah, for the podcast, the thing that's worked out best is just getting your guests to promote the show. And there's a little hack that I learned recently that's helped a lot is the day after the recording, send the guests a calendar placeholder on the day the show's going to go live. And so it's like a little reminder for them. And when they see it, it has a little message like, this is the day that our show is going to go live. Feel free to work with your content team so you can make plans to help promote it. And so that actually nudges them a little bit more, and it's in their calendar, and it's, oh yeah, this podcast show I was on is going to go live. Let's promote it. So that's worked out really well. YouTube's also worked out really well. And I haven't really focused too much like on YouTube SEO or anything like that, but just uploading the interviews on there has gotten a new audience. Each video now is getting 50 or more video views, and I haven't done anything to optimize that channel. But I know it's growing new people who never would have discovered my podcast through ordinary fashion, like Spotify or through Apple Podcasts. Now, in terms of the business, the two things that I'll be focusing on most, first is just LinkedIn content. And I've been pretty active, used to post like maybe 3 or 4 posts a week. And I was very hesitant about posting more than that. But I realized, again, asking myself, what would Alex Hormozi do? He'd be doing 2 posts a day. And so I started just very recently started doing I would say definitely posting every day, but then there's been about 2 or 3 days where I'm also posting in the evening. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a system that I'm using where if I can't come up with new content, I'm recycling old content that's worked out well. And so I have a system for that, like in a Notion doc. But yeah, I'm focusing on LinkedIn, trying to get better with my content. I'm going to really focus on video. I signed up for a course on Skillshare, and right now I'm taking this like DaVinci Resolve course, because the next phase that I really want to grow the business on is going to be through YouTube. And I'm going to create a lot of videos around podcast sponsorships, answering questions like what to look for, how to do good podcast advertising, anything around podcast marketing.
Of course.
That's going to be a big focus. And so that's why I'm taking those courses, and also share those videos on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is the primary one. And then the second thing is going to be testing different ads. So I'll start with Google Ads first. And then after that, I'll go into actually maybe Twitter. I heard the inventory on Twitter right now is very inexpensive. So I want to test that. And then I also want to test LinkedIn, some thought leadership posts and like boosting those, or maybe something else. Now I'm bootstrapping all of this. I don't have a big budget.
I was actually expecting you to tell me that you're doing cold outreach to potential like ICP companies that might like advertise on your podcast. Although obviously you want people to come to you rather than you to them. But like I was actually expecting a bit of cold outreach as well.
We should talk about that, because I have Lead Feeder installed on the new website that I'm launching. So it's B2B PodPros.com. And so I'll be able to see through their technology which companies are visiting my website and which ones have high intent that go into key pages. And I need to figure out how to leverage that data, how to take advantage of it. And so maybe you and I can talk about that, because I think there could be an opportunity for cold outreach, even if I'm not doing a lot. But hey, if it's maybe 2 or 3 a day, that's still something.
Agreed. Although, what would Alex Hormozi do?
Yeah, I don't know if I have the systems in play. That's the other problem is, okay, another big problem I could have is, what if I got 5 clients out all at once? I don't have the inventory yet, right? Because we can only do 2 ads per show at the same time. If we want to give good ROI for our sponsors, we can't just have the shows flooded with ads. So if I got one show that's basically all booked for an entire quarter and they can't have any more sponsorships, then I'm out that podcast. So the other part of the business is bringing on and onboarding new podcasts and trying to get new inventory that's available. So it's one of those things where I really can't scale too fast, because I also have to add new podcasters to the community.
Got it. Okay, so let's go once more through the criteria for becoming a podcaster in your network. So you said at least 30 episodes published. They publish on a regular cadence, so twice a month or like once every 2 weeks, something like that you mentioned. Yeah. And to be rated like top 10 in their category or something.
Ideally, top 10% global rating according to Listen Notes, which is like a podcast search engine. Now, that's ideally. Most of the podcasters in our network have a 10% or higher rating. And then just like you said, consistent, at least a episode published every other week. And ideally minimum 25, 30 episodes published. And the other thing too is just be good to work with. The community, I've created it so that it's fun. In fact, there's a point system. I've gamified it. So if a podcaster helps another podcaster in our community by either subscribing to their show, maybe leaving a star rating, or maybe even going on their podcast as a guest, there's these different points that they can earn. And by the end of June, every 6 months, the top 3 people with the most points, they're going to earn prizes. And so those prizes would be like maybe free dinner on me or something like that. But I want people to be engaged and support one another in the community. This is not just, hey, let me sign up for that so I can make money. No, the people who are going to get the most deals are really the people who are most engaged in the community and helping each other out.
Sounds like a no-brainer. Honestly, it really does for podcasters, especially if you can really feed them ad revenue on a regular cadence. I think it's just a no-brainer, because you're literally giving them money.
Yes.
You are giving them a community of peers who understand them, support them, giving them opportunities to like help each other. So basically you're again reinforcing that community part, and all of that is basically free, and you're even paying them. So I think that's a no-brainer offer. And then for companies, I'm assuming, do you have like criteria to exclude types of companies as well?
Yeah, we specifically focus on SaaS companies, ideally mid to large size. All the ones that have reached out to us, the majority of them, we're talking minimum 100 employees or more. But our audience has got to be ideal for the product. And it's typically software. So SaaS brands, B2B brands, tech companies, those are the ideal clients.
Understood, 100%. All right. Okay. Where can Eric people find you? So you mentioned LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn under Eric Melchor. And then, of course, the website is B2B PodPros. That's where you can learn more about the network and or becoming a podcaster in the community.
Amazing. All right. For the audience, in case that I forgot to ask a very important question to Eric, let me know down in the comments or wherever you listen to the podcast. Let me know what I should have asked Eric about his podcast network. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Eric, I appreciate you for coming on, man.
Hey, pleasure being on here. Thanks for the fun.